Liberians will take to the polls next week Tuesday. Incumbent President George Weah is hoping to be elected for a second term. There are fears of violence, though. We're now joined by Tendai Mbanje, PH.D. candidate for international law at the University of Pretoria. Tendai, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. What do we need to know about the political landscape in Liberia?
Thank you very much, and good morning, and thank you for having me. I think what we have to know about Liberia is that this election marks a critical phase in Liberia's development in democracy. This is the first election since the United Nations mission in Liberia exited in 2018. So this is the first election where Liberians took custody of their own elections. They are conducting these elections without any supervision and without any foreign assistance. So the electoral environment is significant in the sense that these elections will also, if they go well, they will be the first election, or the second election rather, to mark peaceful transition of power in Liberia.
How well oiled are state institutions in the country?
The National Electoral Commission, NEC, is responsible for the administration and the conduct of elections. And so far, there have been concerns, although there have been gains, but there have been concerns, particularly the delays in the National Electoral Commission in executing their mandate. There were issues with voter registration. In this particular election, they introduced BVR, biometric voter registration, but it had issues. There were issues with procurement, among others, so that there were logistical challenges. Then also the inability of NEC, the National Electoral Commission, to hold accountable certain political players that have been violating electoral conduct. Particularly, for example, there have been issues with political financing where there are certain, particularly the incumbent has been implicated for using state resources with advantage. Political parties have complained. There have been issues with using outdated delimitation boundaries, which were the last boundaries were conducted in 2010, and recently in 2022 there was some census, and the latest data on census was not used for to do the delimitation of the electoral constituencies this time. So there have been issues around the administration of the electoral process in general, in terms of certain expectations have been met, and also implementing certain issues that were raised in 2017 elections, particularly. Right now, it's rain season in Liberia. There are issues with movement of voters, access to polling stations, among others. Even electoral observer missions, they are facing challenges in terms of their mobility. So there are many issues raised. I must say that there are issues at hand, but of course, since this is their first election to conduct this among themselves, there have been also progresses, I must say.
Okay, maybe let's talk about some of the progresses, because the incumbent, the former footballer come president, has been accused of weakening state institutions, not staving off corruption enough, to your point, and the example that you have just made, and the deteriorating level or standard of living for Liberians in the West African nation. And so when we take a look at, I don't know if we have polls maybe, what do they suggest? Do people have appetite to take to the streets and to go vote?
Yes, people do have appetite. I've spoken with some colleagues in Liberia. Despite the challenges, I think there is an appetite for change. So there is an expectation that in this first round, there might not be a winner, because the incumbent has a tight contest with the former president, George Weah, because of these corruption allegations and lack of accountability and and being implicated for not having delivered the promises he made prior to assume office. So there is a huge appetite for change on the ground, particularly there is a significant number of new time voters. There's increase of 13.18% of new registered voters, which is a clear indication of huge appetite for change.
You mentioned that there are some gains, though. There's been some good that has been done. Talk to us about that.
I mean, generally, the electoral environment has been, although there have been issues with hate speech, issues of petty politicking, generally we did not see so much violence like many other elections in Africa. We are also noticing that at this stage, some of the gains that it's their first time to conduct elections on their own without any supervision. They're funding it themselves. Although there are logistical challenges, the National Electoral Commission is trying. I mean, I think that credit must be given since the exit of the United Nations mission to Liberia. I think those are gains in my perspective.
All right. I do wonder, though, in terms of democracy on the African continent or in some parts of the continent, is democracy in its current form working on some parts of the continent? Maybe if you take a look also at what's happening if you take a look at what's happening at the so-called coup belt of West Africa, where you find governments are being toppled, and that is done in the name of not enough being done to change the living or the material conditions of people on the ground. And so do we put that down to democracy? Because you've got a number of countries that are going to be heading to the polls, are going to be voting, and things are not changing for some countries. And so people feel aggrieved, and this vicious cycle continues. Does democracy in its current form serve some parts of the continent well?
I think your question is very valid. Democracy, as it's being perceived by Africans, it seems to be highly challenged than ever. It seems not working, to use other words. It seems not working because we see regression in many parts of the continent rather than progression, simply because I think Africans have not taken ownership of the kind of leadership they want. I think there have been some elements of external interferences or external regime agenda, perceived regime agenda in certain parts of the continent, and also the presence of former colonial masters in certain parts of the continent has been perceived as some form of neo-colonialism, some form of continued presence of their agendas. So that has been brought a lot of contestation of democracy. So I think this is the right time for Africans to rethink the kind of democracy they want, to adopt Pan-African perspectives, Pan-African language, Pan-African symbols, to start articulating the democracy that Africa wants. So at this stage, Africa is highly challenged. Democracy seems not to be working in many parts of the continent because there is regression rather than progression.
Tendai, thank you very much for your time this morning. Tendai Mbanje is a PhD candidate at the University of Pretoria.